Thank you so much for that kind introduction. I hesitate because I never know where to start. And in fact, I don't believe in beginnings and endings. So whenever I am asked to speak, and indeed, probably with every lecture that I ever give, I struggle to start. And so I would start, tentatively, by doing what my mother taught me, which is first of all to thank the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute for kindly having me here today. I sure appreciate the opportunity to be a part of this. Secondly, I want to thank Norma Clippard in particular. She must be juggling so many balls that to include juggling my schedule amongst all of those balls was, I mean, it's amazing that I'm here. And it's due to her. So thank you so much, Norma, for having me here. I would almost wonder how she heard about me, but that's a separate subject, I'm sure. But I'm here. And the third, of course, thank you. My mother taught me to say thank you and please and be polite and so forth, which have always stood me in good stead, is to thank you, one and all, for being here today as well. I had no idea, and I'm always amazed by the fact that South Africa still garners so much interest, and indeed that students on this campus flock to my classes. That humbles me, and I don't understand necessarily the interest with South Africa, but perhaps I do, and perhaps I'm just saying I don't. But thank you to each and every one of you for being here. Now, I was going to, and in light of the introduction, I might well start with the impossibility of knowing everything. Because Marcelo Gleiser recently wrote that it is indeed impossible to know everything, and that there are physical constraints to knowing everything. But judging by the curriculum that you have, and that Norma then juggles, it sounds like I have still so much to learn, and you're interested in learning everything. And isn't that an amazing thing, is to say we want to keep on learning, and I hope I, like you, can follow in your footsteps and continue doing that. I do wish I could know everything, but that, of course, is a humble ambition and an impossibility. I was going to talk about those epistemological impossibilities because I had no idea where I was going to start this lecture, as you can hear. But I simply started it with all those lovely thank yous. And so I shall attempt to make a start by saying that I wanted also to show a music clip, a song about Mandela. But I think I can't start there either. So let me start off by talking about the importance then of context. And the reason I was going to start with the fact that we can't know everything is because the question, who was Nelson Mandela? Who was anyone? Who are you? Who am I? That, of course, is a hugely challenging question. And so I guess I want to, along with Samson, who is the author of the biography I've invited you to glance at if you have a moment, talks about the difficulty and the challenges inherent in knowing certainly Nelson Mandela. Samson, in the foreword to the book, the biography, talks about the difficulty of penetrating the myth that is Mandela. The myth that is so powerful, according to Samson, that it blurs all realities. In fact, if you ever were in Mandela's presence, you will know what he means when he says that it turned Mandela into show business. Wherever he went, there were lights and celebrities, and there was always attention. A myth which also, apparently, according to Samson, fascinates children and adults alike. indeed, according to Samson, one of the world's favorite fairy tales. And that's, of course, also related to his regal childhood, his background in a regal sense, his incarceration, and of course his freedom and becoming a president. Now, in Mandela's own words, he was no angel. He admitted himself that he was no angel. And Samson in the biography notes that it isn't realistic to portray Mandela as a saint, and he's often, of course, as you might be aware, upheld as a saint. And indeed, Samson quotes the words of some of his colleagues who are on record as saying that when they dealt with Mandela, they, and I quote, never know whether they're dealing with a saint or a Machiavelli. And so in some respects, and I don't want to simplify this in that way only, and I hope that what I propose is less of a simplification than that, I want to explore, broadly speaking, the sainthood on the one hand and this Machiavellianism on the other. And so I hope if I do anything at all, it will be to give you a realistic, warts and all, insight into who Nelson Mandela was. Because he was a human being, just like you and me, and he loved to say that. He loved to say that. So if we think about Nelson Mandela in the context of what Samson is telling us, Samson tells us that it is really a difficult question to ask and answer, because he himself was an impenetrable person. If you read the foreword alone in that book by Samson, he describes Nelson Mandela as the man with a turned down mouth, and if you've seen him, he does have that turned down mouth. Although if I showed you the film, the song, he also has the most beautiful smile. The man with a turned down mouth and a wary gaze of infinite loneliness. When he's captured on his own, you see that, and this is how his biographer describes him. A man with an impenetrable reserve, a man who, more than many, defended his private hinterland, his privacy, that deep part of him which wasn't easy to get to. So, in some respects, what we are trying to do in this series of 6 lectures is, of course, an impossibility. But insofar as we can scratch the surface, we shall do that. And so, insofar as it is possible to ever know anyone, including oneself, we shall, I think, try and look at Mandela along the following lines. Now, these are some of the themes that I have drawn from the book, and that I hope to explore in the next lectures. But I would say they are neither definitive nor exhaustive. And I would, in fact, welcome any perspectives you might have as you potentially progress through parts of the book or the book in its entirety, and any perspectives you may wish to share with me in relation to characteristics around who Nelson Mandela was. So I offer these by way of introductory framework, by way of themes that I might want to surface as I progress across the next six lectures, or 5, excluding this one. The first one is an intangible, an ethereal thing, which is this question of the symbolic Mandela, the iconic symbolic Mandela. What was that all about? And that cuts in 2 directions. It is about the symbolism that we have projected onto Mandela that gives us a sense of the Mandela we created, which of course then is part of how we understand Mandela. But it is perhaps linked to not only Mandela's Machiavellianism, but his strong sense of showmanship, and also his strong sense of history, that he was particularly adept himself at manipulating and using symbolism at the right time, at the right moment. And I hope to demonstrate and show you some of the masterful use by Mandela of symbolism. And let me digress, because, and I'll probably say this twice, many people remember Mandela and his symbolism in relation to this obsession that South Africans have with so South Africans are sports mad, except me. I'm a nerd and a geek, and I was always interested in books, and people, my fellow South Africans, they thought I was mad, and they were right. Obviously, you will remember the symbolism potentially of him donning the rugby jersey and the impact that had in the post-apartheid South Africa. And people talk about that as that moment of symbolism, but there were so many more. And I want to offer you that sense of history and that use of symbolism, where Mandela didn't only use symbolism in the context of a white minority, but was very proud of his own Xhosa heritage and used symbolism in relation to that during the struggle as well. But I've digressed. The second theme I want to explore in relation to who Mandela was is perhaps a little less angelic. And I'd like to explore this question of why he wasn't an angel. So Nelson Mandela, the firebrand, the revolutionary, indeed possibly the last of the African revolutionary leaders on that continent. Let's try and understand as we move forward a little more about what that was about, what his revolutionary interests and initiatives were about. What did it mean if we said he was a firebrand, he was a revolutionary, and why did that come about? Certainly I'd like to explore a little bit about Mandela, the champion of the underdog. Some folk just do that, and Mandela did that. He had a soft spot for the downtrodden, the marginalized, the poor. And so we want to understand a little bit about why that is. I'm interested, and I hope you are too, in exploring the meditative, studious side of Mandela. It formed a huge part of his life whilst in prison. I met yesterday a man who was incarcerated for 28 years, and he wasn't guilty of the crime that he was incarcerated for. I was crying when I heard his story. And of course, 27 years in jail gives one a long time, which is the time that Mandela was in 3 different jails, gives one a long time to become meditative and studious. I want to talk a little bit about the angelic and Machiavellian combined, as Mandela was a negotiator of huge merit. And so I would suggest, by combining those 2 traits, I guess I tell you already, for those of you who've negotiated, you can see where I'm going. And I'm sure there are folk here who have negotiated all sorts of big and small deals. And finally, I think the thing that astounds folk the most, and often the thing that folk talk about when they ask me, well, Clive, so how on earth do you come out of jail after all those years and not seek revenge? The thing the white minority in South Africa probably feared the most, and we'll talk about their fears as well, by the way, in fact, shortly. So Mandela, the presidential seeker of forgiveness, reconstruction, and reconciliation. The seeker of healing, the people's president. Those are some themes that I propose in the next 5 lectures to surface with you. And as I say, you may well, as you read that book, find others. He and you and I are all complex people. I've obviously simplified, and I hope that that sounds like a reasonable agenda moving forward. Now, in the introduction, I felt like I could talk about so many different things, but you heard that if you had been to South Africa during apartheid, it was pretty horrendous. And so I want to spend this lecture not talking directly about who Mandela was, but about something that you will recognize, that the context within which you grew up and reached the point where you are now has had a huge impact on you. And so it is important, I think, to understand the context within which Mandela lived. And so, if you will indulge me, I would like to portray, I would like to give you a sense of that context. Now, please accept that that is hugely challenging for me. Even in the semester I spend talking about the transition to democracy in South Africa, the abolition of apartheid, the negotiated settlement and so forth, a semester isn't long enough. And then when I go with my students to South Africa after that, even that isn't enough. And in some respects, even we South Africans, as we look back at our history, still haven't come to terms with it. And so what I'm going to endeavor to do in the next 20 minutes or so, or I don't know, 30 minutes, however much time I have, is really compress a lot of that. And the reason I do this is because Mandela, if you remember, was a lawyer. And Mandela, if you read the biography, loved, adored, respected the rule of law. If there was anything about Mandela that's important in relation to knowing him, it was his respect for the law. And so some of what I want to describe to you, these were things that directly impacted and hurt Mandela. And so they influenced him and shaped him, and if you like, prodded and goaded him. And I use those words on purpose, because he did certain things, which we'll talk about, less angelic things. These were things that deeply wounded him, and not only him. So I want to talk about the nature of the state, the nature of apartheid, and the nature of the liberation movement's responses to the state and apartheid. And I want to talk about these broader social and legislative factors, statutory factors, that impacted on Mandela. And then in the next lectures, I will get into more detail in relation to some of this that I'm going to be talking about today that literally did prod him into action. So this lecture from here on is drawn less from the biography than from a most unfortunate source. And that source is simultaneously fortunate. And there is another example of the contradictory nature of South Africa. South Africa is a country full of contradictions. Its people are full of contradictions. And I say fortunate and unfortunate because which country would be proud of having had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission? Which country could, in effect, say, wonderful, we had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission? And yet, of course, we South Africans proudly say, yes, we had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And so we are right to say that. We are right to recognize that. But of course, what it does mean is we got a whole lot wrong. And we got it wrong in some pretty profound ways. And so the rest of this lecture is drawn from not all 7 volumes of the report, because it did run to 7 volumes. And quite frankly, the last 2 volumes are literally hundreds of pages long and are only names. That's right, the names of victims. But in the introduction, there is a wonderful, compressed thumbnail sketch of some of the context that will give you also a sense of the world Mandela was embedded in. And so I intend now to navigate that. As I say, I'm going to cover it superficially, but I hope in enough depth to give you a sense of what it was like to live under apartheid. And so, if you like, the purpose of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission wasn't only to seek forgiveness, wasn't only to deal with the pain of apartheid, wasn't only to reconcile people, but was of course also aimed at getting rid of the lies in circulation in public. In fact, there's a scholar by the name of Ignatief that suggests that one of the primary purposes of any Truth and Reconciliation Commission, if it's done properly, is to reduce the number of lies and myths in circulation in a society. And so, now that we've had the TRC, it is no longer possible to claim that the state had no involvement in human rights abuses. It is no longer possible to claim, we have a historical, factual record, it is no longer possible to claim that the security police had no role in murder and torture and detention without trial and so forth. You see where I'm heading. Yeah? So we've had this, and one of the things that the TRC has enabled us to do is to place in context the history of our country, the history, in fact, not only of our country, but also in the context of the continent. And so we do recognize, I think, from the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that the negotiated settlement was a climactic phase, if you like, in the process of conflict in South Africa that dated right back to the mid-17th century. Well, to the 6th of April 1652, and I know that date because it was drummed into my head when I was a young schoolboy that was when Jan van Riebeeck, a Dutchman, landed at the Cape with his ships. And so since then, European settlers, with the Dutch in the first instance, sought to establish a permanent settlement, a permanent presence on the subcontinent. Now, often, and this is important, I guess, if one wants to understand Mandela, often one thinks of the Afrikaner minority and the Afrikaner government as being responsible for apartheid. And in fact, when I teach this subject, I always say to students, 1948 is an important year because that was the year when the Afrikaner finally came into power in South Africa. But if one wants to understand the context and the nature of South Africa, one can't simply say it was the Afrikaner minority regime that introduced apartheid and that was responsible for segregation and so forth. It certainly wasn't the first to perpetrate some of the most gross, horrendous violations of human rights in South Africa. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission notes one exception, and that is that the Afrikaner developed and perfected the creation of armed militia, armed gangs within the country to foment violence between political parties. But other than that, all the other clever tactics that the Afrikaner used were rooted in a past that goes much further back than 1948. Now, if you wanted to canter through it, and I think we shall, these are some of the key experiences that shaped and formed Nelson Mandela. If one takes the long look back, which is what, of course, the studious and meditative Mandela did, besides reading world history and world politics and so forth. The first of those was the importation of slaves into the Cape in 1652. And for anyone who goes to Cape Town, I would recommend that you go to the relatively new slave museum, which is a museum in a house where slaves were kept. not only the importation of slaves, but of course the brutal treatment that was meted out to them and that they endured between 1652 and that magical date of 1834. Of course, it took a little longer, but around that time when slavery was abolished and slaves were freed, although the extent to which they were freed in South Africa and the ways in which that occurred, I'm sure you might have some sense of your history, and it wasn't straightforward. There were many wars of dispossession and colonial conquest, dating from the first war against some of the indigenous folk in South Africa, the Khoisan. And it didn't take the Dutch long. In 1659, there was the first of these multiple and many wars. Multiple frontier conflicts as white settlers continued to penetrate northwards, and uprisings such as the Bambata uprising in 1906, which was the last attempt by an indigenous group to defend itself. That was the last known opportunity for an indigenous group to defend itself against colonial settlers. The systematic hunting and elimination, and I digress again, the systematic hunting and elimination also for fun, for sport, of the San and the Khoi by settler groups. Getting on their horses, both the Boers, the Afrikaners, and the British, and hunting down for fun the Khoi people and the San people, nomadic settlers, living off the land, eating tubers, roots, etc., etc., being hunted and destroyed. The next one recognizes for what it is, but I want to caution that the right in South Africa, the extreme right, likes to remind us that black people like to kill each other, and they do this in a particularly politicized way. And I want to caution you that this next example is sometimes used in that context, but as a matter of historical record and in thinking about the violence and the warfare that occurs in South Africa, we also know about the Difekane and the Mfekane, which were attempts by the Zulus to create a supernation, and as they continue to drive southwards from the northeast, and as the Xhosas drove northwards, from the south, that clash and the Zulu ambition to create a huge state resulted in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Zulus and Xhosas. So a Zulu-inspired process of state formation and state dissolution. The war between the British and the Boers, the Afrikaner, and there were two of them, but the war in 1899 to 1902 is another such violent aspect of our past. A war in which 20,000 women and children were herded into concentration camps by the British. And you know, my mother used to tell me stories about the things that she'd heard they'd done in those concentration camps. And I tell you that just to say that again, I'm sure half of it or more might have been lies and myth. But these are the kinds of myths that I was talking about that a process such as this one then helps us get rid of. Fact of the matter is the British perpetrated gross human rights abuses in relation to those women and children who were captured in camps like Wienen, which is Afrikaans Dutch for weeping. And then, of course, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission points out that there was a genocidal war in Southwest Africa, which was a South African protectorate against the Herero people. And so if one takes the long look in terms of context, you begin to see, I think, what I'm heading towards, which is a country which has a long history of war and conquest and difference and violent difference. So the mandate of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and where we begin to locate Mandela perhaps more precisely was 1960 to 1994. It wasn't interested necessarily in digging into the detail of centuries, but rather decades starting at 1960. But it is also at huge pains to point out that it wasn't the Afrikaner that introduced apartheid, and that in many respects the British colonial presence in South Africa was a huge precursor to, and in fact laid the groundwork for, this abhorrent system of apartheid. And what the Afrikaner did post-1948, which I shall describe shortly, was just perfecting what already in many respects existed. So, and I guess I'm not going to describe some of the detail that I have here in relation to some of the specific acts which the British then did. But suffice it to say that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and its findings, and the world that Mandela inherited and then grew up in, is a world where the South African Defence Force, the South African Police, the National Intelligence Services, and other clandestine units and so forth. It's a world where they were operating in terms of well-established historical traditions of the use of excessive and unjustifiable force in the way in which interactions between people were regulated. And the TRC says that they are saying this not to exonerate anyone, but to place what happened in South Africa in historical context. Apartheid was a huge exercise in social engineering. The National Party certainly wasn't the first party in that country to embark on that type of social engineering. One of the most ambitious and far-reaching attempts, in fact, at social engineering in the 20th century, in 20th century South African history, is a thing that was introduced by the English post-unification political party, the South African Party, and it's known as the 1913 Land Act. Has anyone heard of the 1913 Land Act in South Africa? You might well have. I think I see some nods here. And the record, scholars, academics, researchers have told us that if you think about all the legislation and all that underpinned apartheid, no single piece of legislation shaped South African history more dramatically, and no single piece of legislation shaped South Africa more drastically than this particular piece of legislation. It laid the basis for the territorial, the geographic separation of white and non-white. It destroyed at a stroke a thriving African land-owning population, and not only a thriving land-owning population, but also a thriving peasant agricultural sector, if you see what I'm saying. So it did so by prohibiting land ownership outside of 7% of land allocated in what was at that point beginning to be described as African reserves. Reserves for African people, non-white people. And of course, the consequences of that included deaths as a result of lack of access to land, which led to livelihoods and sustained folk. So we need to remember the importance of the 1913 Land Act. And so it is that in 2004, Sam Rugege published in a law journal the following statement: 80% of the population was confined to 13%. It had increased from 7 to 13. 80% of the population was confined to 13% of the land, while less than 20% owned over 80% of the land. This apportionment of land remained virtually unchanged until the abolition of apartheid. We are 21 years old, so we've just come of drinking age in Tennessee, I think. Not that that mattered to me, but it matters to some of my students. And in fact, you know, I'm on video now, so I was going to start off by saying something about video, which is, of course, that I ban it in my classrooms. And when you are right to react in that way, because where does video go to these days, and how is it manipulated, and what is it used for? And so I don't ban anything except video. I don't like bans, but be that as it may. So this apportionment of land remained unchanged till the abolition of apartheid, and you know what I'm going to say next. It hasn't changed much in the 21 years that we have now come of age. So by and large, studies now will tell you, and perhaps this is the subject for another talk. I did one recently where I criticized the South African transition for the first time in public, and I think I'm allowed to do that because I criticized myself as I was part of that transition. I criticized myself for being myopic. I criticized myself for not getting the design criteria right in relation to the architecture of the transition. And I'd be happy to repeat that at some point. It was hard for me to do. But yes, we did get many things wrong, and the result of getting a lot of those things wrong is, amongst other things, the status quo that's been maintained.
Are you saying that the ANC has not yet reallocated those lands?
Yes, I'm saying that. Yeah. I'm saying that boldly and openly. Yes, that they have been challenged for not and have not allocated those lands. And indeed, and we digress, of course, but what a wonderful digression! And thank you for the question. The emergence of a new political party with an agenda that says we want to nationalize all the land, and we want to nationalize all the economic means of production, including the mines, and that the wealth of the country belongs to the people who live in it. That is as a direct result of the slow pace of change in South Africa, where in particular young folk are saying we're fed up. We do not accept our plight in this country because the pace of change and the promises that were made were so beautiful and meant so much to us, and our forefathers fought so hard for them, that why is it that we still live in abject poverty with no access to resources and the status quo is maintained? And so I was talking about reasons as to why we got the transition wrong. And lest I be accused again of being reactionary, which I'm not, let me say that it was right that we did what we did, and I'm proud of what we did, and I was part of that, and I'm proud to have played a part in that. But of course it is with that wonderful thing called hindsight that I then criticize the transition, and so I accept that, and I look back at it and say, I was saying if I wanted to bake a cake, and you might have liked that bit of cake, and you might have wanted to bake it, I ought to be able to give you a recipe that enables you to bake that same cake. And so for folk who have to unfortunately go through a transition, I want to make sure that we give the right recipe to the world, because often we're held up as a case study in conflict resolution, as a case study in negotiation, as a case study in transition. And fine, you know, there are things that we can take from that, but there certainly are also things that we didn't get right.
Are you favoring Julius Malema then? His ideas?
So that's an interesting question, because it encourages me to take a political position. And having been the chief executive of a political party for some years, 4 years or so, the United Democratic Movement, I guess I took a position then. And so I wouldn't say that I am supportive of Julius Malema. But what I guess I'm suggesting is I can see where some of those thoughts and perspectives and ideas come from. And I think it's important for us to recognize the source of some of that, and also the danger of that turning into a militant form of insistence, not just a political form. And that's a borderline sort of situation where you could almost see that anger spilling out into the streets. So it was in that context that I was suggesting one can see also what's happening on South African campuses. The excrement that was thrown at Cecil John Rhodes, at his statue on the campus at the University of Cape Town. The fact that when I went to visit my hometown recently, I was encouraged to, well, let me put it to you this way. Queen Victoria, standing in the public square, was wearing a dress that covered her from head to toe, a tarpaulin. I don't know if that's the right word here in the States, yeah? And why was she covered in a tarpaulin? Well, I'll tell you, because the pace of change in South Africa is too slow. But she was covered in a tarpaulin because she'd had excrement thrown at her and was then also given a green polka dot treatment. And so what I was going to say is I looked up the dress of Queen Victoria to see what she was wearing, and of course she had green polka dot underwear on. That's kind of why I sometimes, just to sort of be provocative, say, you know, I did that. And I have a photograph, in fact, on this computer of that, because I use it.
Don't forget to play Johnny Clegg.
Thank you so much.
That's a great song.
Thank you so much. Johnny Clegg was, of course, chased out of a venue when I was a first-year student because he had dedicated that concert to 4 people who were killed, the so-called Craddock 4. And we were holding candles up, and Johnny Clegg was singing, "Thank you so much." And the police piled in there, and we scattered. So that was taken in June. That is indeed Queen Victoria in that dress, that tarpaulin. And so, you know, it does remind me a little bit. I don't like to talk about America because I'm not American, so I talk about South Africa. And you can draw your own parallels and conclusions. Confederate flags and other things. You know, I don't intend to be controversial today. I simply intend to tell you about my country and the fact that Cecil John Rhodes no longer is on the university campus in Cape Town, and the fact that the debate in South Africa about what to do with some of these statues that cause so much pain in the hearts of so many is a big debate. Does one really want to deface them in that way? Does one really want to break them, vandalize them? What might one want to do with them? That there's also a rational debate, not just a student-driven and popular, perhaps. Isn't it beautiful how conversations can just wander in all sorts of different ways? Because, like, I had none of this prepared, and I brought this lovely picture with, you know, and I thank you so much for these opportunities to just talk. And if there's time, I don't know how I'm doing for time. Will someone hold me accountable to time? Because if the invitation exists to show that bit of music, perhaps we can end with that. I would love to do that. Thank you so much. We shall dash. Yes, sir.
You said the youth are impatient and disillusioned. Are the educators similarly disillusioned, and are they still leaving the country because they hate the slow pace?
So the question relates to the challenges around education in South Africa and the slow pace of reform in the education system. We shall touch on some of the precursors to the challenge. The fact of the matter is the education system in South Africa has collapsed, has failed. That's a stark statement. But that is indeed, sir, the case. And that education in South Africa is in dire straits. So teachers are disillusioned, students are disillusioned, there's a lack of resource. And let me, by the way, say that it is a constitutional right of every South African, A, to be educated, and B, to be educated in their mother tongue. 11 languages we have a constitutional right to speak and be recognized in public life in, and yet, of course, the interpretation of the Constitution by the Constitutional Court is it depends on the resources of the state as to how much of the Constitution can be implemented. So the answer, of course, is so the education system is a mess, and we are desperate to fix it. There are a number of students here also on this campus who have been to South Africa, who have been in schools, who come and see me occasionally, and who are very motivated to try and help. But of course we'll take every bit of help we can. But yeah, education is it's not the only problem. If we were to talk, if we had a discussion on contemporary South Africa, I would be talking about governance challenges, including aspects such as corruption and so forth. I would be delivering a very different lecture. But what I do want to do, if you will allow me then just a few more minutes to give you a context for the next lectures in relation to what were the things that were driving Mandela. I will skip the bits about British constitutional chicanery and simply say that discrimination existed well before 1948. And so let's head to 1948 and talk a little bit about why that's important. Yes, sir.
Do the libraries contain books that have been updated, and are they used by the students?
No. And even the books in the schools are still, I've been to schools and looked at the history and other books, and they simply have the same history that I learned. And that's, of course, hugely problematic. That's just a, you know. And there are other factors. I sense a hunger to talk about contemporary South Africa. I do indeed. And perhaps I might then devote a lecture to that, if you will allow me to move off the path a little bit. Is that okay? Okay, so I might end along those lines, because I think I might do a little bit about my critique of the transition and where we are now, and what I think my diagnosis means for a prognosis, for where we might see things heading, also in the context of questions like Julius Malema and other things, where we might be going. So the government in 1948 was the first time the Afrikaner, and there are people like Verwoerd who are on record as saying, finally took back their country. Finally took ownership, political power, took back their country. That new government at the time set out to segregate. And so what was the difference between the past and the future was they set out to segregate every aspect of life, political, economic, cultural, sporting, social, etc. They did this under the sham of democracy. They used a whites-only parliament, they used the electoral system, they used the courts of law to push through everything that enabled them statutorily and otherwise to define life in South Africa. So apartheid sought to maintain, if you like, the status quo of white supremacy. If you think about apartheid, it was a massive exercise in social change and in social engineering. What type of social change was it? Well, it certainly was reactionary in terms of change theory, and in that respect can be seen as a theory, as an ideology both of change and non-change, a reversion back to an ideal of white purity, also on the grounds of religion and so forth, to revert to something that the Afrikaner wanted back. So to achieve its goals, Parliament in 1948, run by the Afrikaners, transformed what can be known as a laissez-faire and ad hoc, if you like, pattern of pre-1948 social settlement and interaction. It sought to transform that into a systematic pattern of legalized, of statutory racial discrimination. So there's a big difference between the past, with the exception of odds and ends. I call them odds and ends, like the 1913 Land Act. So that was why I needed to describe some of what had occurred in the past. So the statutory system was the one thing, and the other thing that the apartheid minority regime did was it put in place a central, powerful bureaucracy and military machine to uphold this edifice of apartheid statute. So not only did you have the statute, the law, you also had a bureaucracy and a military force to uphold all of that. Yeah. I wrote here that it had that this security apparatus had been armed with awesome legal powers. I use the word awesome because I learned that word here, and it seems to resonate well with Americans. If I use South Africanisms or Britishisms, if there is such a word, I think I've just butchered a word. So there was so much legislation that it is indeed impossible for me to run through all the legislation. If you really are interested, there are long lists of legislation in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's report, for argument's sake. I describe it as a spider's web, and I do this because if you've observed an insect in a spider's web, it doesn't matter which way the poor creature goes, it is going to be caught by that spider's web, and so it was with the spider's web of apartheid legislation. If the one didn't get you, the other one would. Apartheid, I've heard some folk tell me, it's pronounced apartheid. And some people then link it with the word hate. But it doesn't really mean hate in and of itself. Apartheid is the state of apartness, the being. It's an ontological word. It's a word that says, I struggle to describe it. It's a condition of apartness. It's a prevailing circumstance. That's what it really means. Of course, it's underpinned by hate. It was enforced and served to institutionalize racial discrimination and domination by white people over all people of other races. Let me highlight some of the legislation, because the point is, some of this legislation, Mandela being a lawyer, as I said, was central to Mandela's formation as a character, his character formation, and his responses and actions, as we'll see in the next lectures. So if you think about the kinds of legislation that were put in place, there was statutory legislation that regulated population registration and segregation. Why do white people talk about, South Africans talk about coloreds, whites, Indians, and blacks? Because of some of the population registration and segregation acts, which to this day still imbue our discourse with this obsession with color. There was statutory legislation around job reservation and economic apartheid, segregation in education, sexual apartheid, land tenure and geographic segregation, pass laws, so mobility, influx control, there were laws for that. Of course, laws around political representation or lack thereof, separate development and the so-called Bantustans or the black homelands, laws for detention without trial, and laws relating to state security. Let me just quickly touch on some of what irked Mandela most, so when we talk about what irked Mandela, he would be really angry with me if I was saying that here now. He would castigate me and he would wag his finger at me and say, Clive, you shouldn't talk like that, because of course he would care more about the millions of people in South Africa that were impacted on, not him. He didn't care that it impacted him per se. He cared about the fact that this impacted on so many of his brothers and sisters. The Population Registration Act of 1950 is the reason why we talk about black, colored, white, and Indian. It defined people in terms of color, and it gave bureaucrats the power to decide who was white, who was black, who was colored, and who was Indian. I do apologize for that terminology, but it's a matter of fact that that's how South Africans speak, and it comes directly from this Population Registration Act. So it defined South Africans into one of 4 racial categories. Do you want to hear a bizarre definition of racial groupings? Shall I read it quickly? A white person is one who is in appearance obviously white and not generally accepted as colored, or who is generally accepted as white and is not obviously non-white, provided that a person shall not be classified as a white person if one of his natural parents has been classified as a colored person or a Bantu. Because remember, there's a distinction between a colored person and a black person. A Bantu is a person who is or who is generally accepted as a member of any aboriginal race or tribe of Africa. A colored person is a person who is not a white person or a Bantu. So, in effect, what the bureaucracy could then do was arbitrarily, there was nothing really pinning them down there, say, you're colored, you're black, and not have to give too many reasons for that. There's so much to be said about those tests and about the way in which the bureaucracy abused that power. There's so much, I mean, you know, I'm touching superficially on so much here. Literally that we could go into a series of lectures on what that meant and how that played out and so forth. But the result was human devastation. No words, according to John Dugard, who wrote in 1972, no words can capture the misery and human suffering caused by this legislative scheme, which resulted in the division of families, amongst other things, simply owing to the different racial classifications of members of the same family. The guy who's replacing Jon Stewart on The Daily Show makes a joke of this. Yeah, have you heard the joke? He talks about the fact that his mother was black and he's colored, and when they walked down the street in South Africa and the police came along, she had to let go of his hand. He compares that to the way in which folk might let go of a bag of marijuana when they're accosted by the police. He makes a joke of it, of course. That's the kind of thing that, you know, it cut across all the so-called color lines. The Group Areas Act, the country was demarcated into geographic zones for exclusive occupation by designated racial and ethnic groups. Yeah? The result of this, and we're going to see some footage in the next lecture, which goaded Mandela into action. The result of this was mass population transfer. Mass, ladies and gentlemen, mass population transfer, involving the uprooting of almost exclusively black folk, and the wholesale destruction of communities, razing them to the ground with bulldozers. We'll see it. You don't have to take my word for it. You'll see it if you have the stomach for it, because I will ask if you do, and I won't show anything you don't want me to show. Communities like Sophiatown, District 6, Cato Manor, and in my hometown, South End. Sophiatown, when it was flattened to the ground, in fact, let me not say that. Let me say that in the next lecture. And of course, the consequences, can you imagine? Can you simply imagine? You're black, you live with you're married to a colored woman, and you have, I don't know, beautiful children. I want to say that. But they might also be different colors. All of a sudden, the bulldozers come in, and your wife has to go that way, and your husband has to go that way, and what of the kids? Well, and so the state will have determined that. The state will have determined that. If the state decided they were black, that arbitrary bureaucrat, they might have gone with the black father. If they decided they were colored and the mother was colored or whatever, they would have gone the other way. The state would have decided that.
How could the state decide? From the color of them?
So it was, as I was saying, an arbitrary, very vague statute, and at the whim of the bureaucrat to ultimately decide that. which is why you're asking. It's because how did they decide?
How long did it stay like this? How long?
So from 1948, this act was in power from 1948 till about, probably repealed in like the late 80s. Yeah, 85 or something. The 1949 Prohibition of Mixed Marriages Act and the 1950 Immorality Amendment Act. The name of that act already tells you what the Afrikaner thought about sex across the color line. The Immorality Act, so it was immoral. All future interracial marriages were prohibited when the Afrikaner came into power. All forms of sexual contact, a kiss, a peck on the cheek even, were prohibited by the Afrikaner. Let me tell you, and what I've written here in my notes, I've got this word in bold, this Immorality Act was energetically enforced by the state apparatus, the police and others, who sought out opportunity to catch interaction across the color lines. Suicides by those caught in the web of these provisions, etc. The impact of this. The pass laws. The pass laws were hated by black South Africans because the pass laws meant you couldn't move anywhere without a thing known as the dam pass, the dompas. And this was like a passport book which contained a huge range of information. In fact, if you wanted to live in a particular place, not only did the state have to authorize that, but your employer had to endorse that dompas. And you were only allowed to live there where you had employment. So this dompas, South Africans, blacks over the age of 16 had to carry this thing on them at all times. At all times, ladies and gentlemen. So what did that mean? The spider's web analogy. The police used to set up at a train station or at an employer, a large one. I heard Firestone mentioned, but others. Wait at the gate. I mean, haven't you forgotten something before? I bet you've forgotten something now. I probably have. Into the police van, into jail. Because who could pay the fine? People didn't even have the money to buy the train ticket, never mind pay the £20 fine or whatever, £10 fine or whatever it was. Fingerprints, photographs, personal details of employment, permission from the government to be in a particular part of the country, qualifications to work, you get the idea. The Suppression of Communism Act, which also was part of the way in which Mandela was then put on trial and some of the reason why he ended up in jail, provided for the banning of political activity. Initially the banning of the Communist Party, but the act was interpreted so widely that it was used to ban all political opposition. All forms of dissent, communist, radical, liberal, radically religious, or anyone that was just plain annoying, had that act slapped on them. You're a communist, there you go. And I haven't got the definition here, but in my notes I say it did this through the inclusion of a definition of communism that was absurd in its breadth and vagueness. And you can probably go and look it up and read it for yourself. The Separate Immunities Act, I remember this one clearly as a child because I grew up on the beach, and the beach had barbed wire fences running down it, and this bit of beach was for whites. I was white. The next bit of beach had barbed wire next to it was for blacks. The beach, the black beach in South Africa, was next to the sewage farm, and there's a pipe where the sewage comes out into the sea. That bit of beach, and I can show you that. If you come with me to Port Elizabeth, I will show you that. That bit was for coloureds, and that bit was for Indians. The allocation was made on a wholly unequal basis, with the result that the facilities and amenities were, to all effects and purposes and intents, non-existent for black South Africans. The Bantu Education Act, I mean, I don't need to describe it. Inferior education. The education minister at the time suggested, in fact didn't suggest, said that black people needed to be educated in accordance with their position in life. He said that. Yes, sir. The Extension of University Act, etc., etc., etc. Thank you so much. So the National Party had led, in fact, when it came into power, a counter-revolution, a white counter-revolution to forestall the threat to white supremacy. And in simplified fashion, saw this threat in the context of two dangers. And true to their form, they described these dangers in terms of color. The one was die swart gevaar, the black danger. The other one was die rooi gevaar, the red danger, and interpreted the existential threat to them in broad terms in the context of these two social forces, or so they saw. They were to form elaborately detailed centerpieces of an all-pervasive military mobilization, substantially based on their perceived red and black fear. I end by saying that it wasn't necessarily the heroes of apartheid that one should interpret the experience. So one shouldn't interpret the experience through their eyes, but through the experience of the day-to-day life of black people under apartheid. And it was in this way that Mandela interpreted apartheid. It wasn't for him that people were murdered in jails and that people had their human rights abused and so forth. He was as concerned about what it was like for everyone to live on a daily basis under apartheid. And in the kind introduction you heard the word brutal. I think, did you mention that word? But we spoke about it. It was a horror. And so I hope to some extent I have managed to convey to you the context within which the rest of my discussions about who Mandela was, the context within which those discussions will take place. I thank you for your attention, and I'm sorry I ran out of time.